Mr. President, today I want to talk about an issue that has gotten a lot of attention here in Washington and around the country over the past week or so, and that's the issue of children who cross our border, both those who cross the border illegally with their parents and those who come alone. Those who come alone are known as unaccompanied children, or UACs. First, I want to reiterate something that I've said a number of times over the past few weeks, and that is I oppose the policy of separating children from their parents. I think it's counter to our American values. As we'll talk about this afternoon, though, it's also inconsistent with the infrastructure we have in place to be able to deal with it. I was pleased to see the administration agree that we should keep families apprehended at the border together, and I was pleased to see the executive order the President issued to that effect yesterday. I've co-sponsored legislation on this issue that has now been co-sponsored by 32 of my Senate colleagues, I'm told. So it has the support of almost one-third of this chamber, which would in effect take the executive order and put that into law, but also make some other changes that are necessary to ensure that we can have a sustainable policy with regard to children coming across the border. I believe we can have strong border security without separating families at the border. I believe we can enforce our nation's laws, and we should, while remaining true to our values. Children should be kept in a safe, caring environment with their parents while immigration officials quickly assess each family's individual immigration case. That's the best solution. Beyond the moral argument for holding this policy, by the way, the logistics of separating families is just not practical. Let me talk about what currently happens with unaccompanied children. We talked earlier about two categories. One is children who come with their parents, which has been the issue really we've been discussing the last week. But there's a bigger issue with regard to those children in the sense of the number of children who are in the system, and that's those children who come on their own. As chairman of the Permanent Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, PSI, I have been investigating over the past couple of years the handling of UACs, again, these kids who come unaccompanied. I've done this, therefore, both during the Obama administration and during the Trump administration. And from the work we've done over the past 2 years, I can tell you that the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Homeland Security are not prepared to effectively deal with even more children, unaccompanied minors, or those who come in with their parents. There are two key issues we need to address with unaccompanied children who enter the United States. First, we need to ensure that if our government takes charge of these children, they're not trafficked or abused. These are children. They need to be treated as such. Second, we need to uphold our rule of law and make sure that our immigration system actually works. To do that, we need to make sure these children appear for their immigration court proceedings. I'm afraid we're failing on both counts right now, and that's unacceptable. And let me explain what I mean. I first got involved in this issue, very deeply involved, back in 2015, a few years ago, when reports came out that there were 8 unaccompanied minors from Guatemala who had come up to our southern border, crossed over. A ring of human traffickers lured them to the United States, by the way. The traffickers had actually gone to Guatemala, talked to these kids' parents, told them they would provide these kids with an education in America, actually got the mortgages for some of the homes as payment. To pay for the trafficking and the smuggling debt, the traffickers retained not just the mortgages for these homes, but they said when they got the kids in their control, they weren't going to let the kids go until these debts were totally paid off. So they weren't interested in giving them an education. Turns out they were just interested in trafficking these kids. Anyway, when the kids crossed the border, they were apprehended. Their status, as defined by federal immigration law, was that of an unaccompanied child, or a UAC. So they were considered to be UACs. This means the Department of Homeland Security picks them up, Customs and Border Protection. Following protocol, are then transferred to the Department of Human Services, Health and Human Services, HHS. So one federal department picks them up. They take them to another federal department called the Department of Health and Human Services. And HHS, Health and Human Services, is supposed to then keep these kids for a short period of time until they can be placed with sponsors. That's how the system works. The sponsors then are supposed to ensure these kids stay safe and get them to their appropriate immigration legal proceeding. Unfortunately, based on our investigation, often that does not happen. And it certainly didn't happen in this case. What happened in this case, as our investigation was able to reveal, is that these kids, brought up from Guatemala by these traffickers, taken into custody, gone to HHS for short-term in a detention facility, then they were sent out to sponsors. Guess who the sponsors were, who these kids were given to? The traffickers. They were given to traffickers, not to family members or friends or someone who could be trusted. You think of a surrogate family or a foster family. They were put into the custody of the human traffickers. They didn't vet these people. And as a result, the traffickers took these kids north, took them to my state of Ohio, which is, again, how I got engaged and involved in this. They took them to an egg farm in Marion, Ohio, where these kids lived in squalid conditions. They were required to work 12 hours a day, 6-7 days a week. Their paychecks were often confiscated by the traffickers, so they were basically getting room and board. The traffickers threatened these kids and their families with physical harm if the kids didn't perform these long hours, work under these terrible conditions. Fortunately, this trafficking ring was discovered, these kids were rescued, and they've now been prosecuted. But what our investigation found out when we tried to figure out how could this possibly have happened is that HHS didn't do the background checks on those sponsors. They didn't also respond to a bunch of red flags that should have alerted them to problems with these kids and with the sponsors. For example, HHS missed that a group of sponsors were collecting multiple kids. That should have been a red flag right there. Not just one child, but multiple children. They missed a major red flag when a social worker working with HHS showed up to help one of these kids, or tried to, and the sponsor turned the social worker away. This is somebody on contract with HHS. That didn't raise a red flag. We held a hearing in January of 2016. HHS committed at that hearing they were going to do better. They were going to take care of these kids. This is a federal agency. And to have a federal agency give kids to traffickers and have this tragic situation unfold is just unacceptable. That was during the Obama administration, by the way. So remember, this is not a partisan issue. During previous administrations and during this administration, this system has not worked. After that hearing, HHS and DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, under which we have the Border Patrol, Border Protection Service, they committed to clarifying their respective responsibilities for protecting these kids. Because one thing we found out is, nobody was really accountable. So people were pointing fingers at each other, and the kids were falling between the cracks. HHS and DHS entered into a 3-page memorandum of agreement, which said that the agencies recognized they should ensure that these kids aren't abused or trafficked. The memorandum also said the agencies would enter into a joint concept of operations, spelling out their specific responsibilities within a year's time, that would be done by February of 2017. That's, of course, what I was looking for and what our committee was looking for. How are you going to handle these kids? Who's responsible for them? What's the handoff? Who's accountable? That was supposed to be due, again, in February of 2017. Today is June 2018. That operations agreement between the agencies is still not completed. They missed their own deadline by about 1.5 years. They have promised, by the way, based on a hearing we recently had with HHS, to complete this agreement and to get it to us, this joint concept of operations, by July 30. So we are expecting it, within 4 or 5 weeks, and we're very much looking forward to that. This was based on a hearing we had in April of this year. We called DHS and HHS back again to explain what's going on, why we hadn't seen an agreement, despite virtually every couple weeks them telling us it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. We wanted to hear how they would work better together to ensure that these kids were placed in safe environments and be sure they were following up with these children, to ensure that the kids actually went to their immigration court proceedings. So it's not just about ensuring that they aren't abused and trafficked. Everyone, of course, agrees with that. Everyone should also agree that they ought to go to their court hearing. and we ought to be sure the system works. We've made some progress since that 2016 hearing. For example, under the Trump administration, HHS started making telephone calls to follow up, which I think is a good idea. These were 30-day wellness check telephone calls after they placed an unaccompanied minor with a sponsor. HHS testified at our April hearing that from October to December of last year, they had the data now on the calls that they had made. These are the 30-day calls they're making after these kids go out with their sponsors. Those calls revealed that about 1,500 children were unaccounted for. In other words, they placed the call, talked to the sponsor, said, you know, how is this child doing? And the sponsors wasn't responsive. Either said, we don't know how the child's doing. They couldn't find the sponsor. They couldn't find the child. In some cases, the children had actually run away. So 1,500 kids unaccounted for. It doesn't mean they're not with a family somewhere. It doesn't mean they're not even going to their court case, but they couldn't find these kids, 1,500 kids. That's unacceptable. And I'm now working on a bipartisan basis, Republicans and Democrats alike, with new legislation that will be informed by this concept of operations we hope to have in the next several weeks here, but that will lay out how we ought to treat unaccompanied minors and hold someone accountable, particularly HHS, that has these children in their custody, and prior to that, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, to ensure that these sorts of incidences will not happen again and ensure that we can know where these kids are. By the way, there's lots of experience in this area. Think about your home state and the foster care system, which is probably overburdened right now because of the opioid crisis. But you have a foster care system where foster parents are actually screened. Part of our legislation, by the way, is to tell the states where the kids are, so the states can play a role in this as well. What this all highlights is the fact that the federal government is not doing nearly enough to protect unaccompanied minors from trafficking and other forms of abuse, and not doing enough to ensure that they get to their court date, right? So we've got a system, we've got these kids in the system. I don't care what your views are on immigration policy. It doesn't matter whether you believe that we should have a much more secure border and a wall, or whether you believe that there ought to be more of an open border and a catch and release system. Nobody should want to have these kids treated like this. Everyone should want to ensure that these kids are cared for properly and they get to their court date. Ensure that we don't have the kinds of tragic incidences we had in my home state of Ohio. But I also think it's important not to conflate these two issues together, the unaccompanied kids and the 1,500 who were unaccounted for, and what has happened over the last several weeks down in the border with separating families from children. We're talking about, again, kids that come unaccompanied. Unfortunately, a lot of people have conflated the two. There was a New York Times story about the fact that 1,500 kids have gone missing, and somehow that got conflated with a lot of folks online and some folks even here in this chamber with this notion that this is about the separation policy and the zero tolerance policy. It's not. It's something different. But what it says to me is, let's not add more children to a system that's not working. In other words, as I said earlier at the start, we don't have the infrastructure in place to deal with it. It's one reason I felt strongly that separating kids from their families was not only the wrong thing to do in terms of a moral policy, but also in terms of our government's ability to handle it. Even if there was a situation where it was important to get this kid away from a family where maybe there was a sign of abuse, or maybe the kid was being trafficked, we've got to have a better system in place to deal with these children who are unaccompanied or others who end up in this system. So what was happening under the zero tolerance policy, so-called zero tolerance policy over the last 6 weeks, was that adults illegally crossing the border were arrested and put in detention facilities. And under what is called the Flores Settlement Agreement from a 1997 court decision, if the adults were traveling with children, those children had to be placed in what the court says is the least restrictive setting possible, not allowing them often to stay with their mom or dad in detention. That's been one of the arguments the Trump administration has been making, that's one reason with the zero tolerance policy and the parents going into the criminal justice system and going into that kind of detention, the kids couldn't go with them because of this court decision. It's an issue. There's no question about it. It's the primary reason why they are saying they put about 2,000 children into the care of HHS and DHS, essentially turning them into unaccompanied minors, again, putting them in a system that, in my view, is not working. What we've seen over the past 2 years is that DHS and HHS are just not adequately prepared to keep track of these kids and ensure they're placed in safe environments and ensure they get to their court hearings. So again, as soon as I understood what was going on with separating families, I spoke out and said, this is bad. We cannot allow this to happen for both reasons. Not the moral thing to do, but also we don't have the infrastructure. And on Tuesday, I signed a letter to Attorney General Jeff Sessions calling on him to stop this practice of separating kids from their families, giving it a pause so that we can have the opportunity to look at this issue, develop the right legislation that we've now introduced. This letter, by the way, was led by my colleague, Senator Orrin Hatch, and was signed by 11 of our colleagues. Again, I commend the administration for the executive order yesterday that keeps families apprehended at the border together. That's a positive first step. But we've got to go even further. Because of this Flores decision we talked about earlier, which is, again, a settlement that was made back in 1997, Congress is going to have to step in as well. I think it's likely that the executive order will be in litigation immediately because of the Flores decision. The legislative solution that Congress enacts needs to address the Flores settlement agreement as it applies to children who arrive with their parents. In those cases, the settlement agreement currently requires, again, these children be separated from their families and kept in the least restrictive setting possible instead of staying with their families if their families are in detention. This legislation we introduced yesterday, called Keep Families Together and Enforce the Law Act, again, has almost a third of the Senate signing on. It'll provide that long-term solution to keep families together and expedite these immigration cases. Unlike other proposals, which would incentivize more illegal immigration, in my view, by essentially codifying past practice where people are apprehended but then released into the community, this legislation actually solves the problem by keeping families together while ensuring the integrity of our immigration laws. And again, it, among other things, overrides the Flores settlement agreement, ensuring that families are kept together during their immigration enforcement proceedings. But importantly to me, it also expedites these proceedings. And this is one of the problems that I've seen in the immigration system. We have so many cases, there's such a backlog, and so much time required to get to a decision that it creates a lot more problems in terms of what do you do with folks who've come across the border. So this would expedite and prioritize these cases of families, provide lots more immigration judges, which got to get a decision on these people. You need to have more immigration judges and a better process. More money, frankly, is going to be needed, increased resources, to be sure that infrastructure is in place to deal with this issue as quickly as possible, to get a decision, an appropriate decision as to whether the person stays or leaves. I hope more of my colleagues will sign on to this legislation. I hope they'll do it on a bipartisan basis. I think the Keep Families Together and Enforce the Law Act is the right position that finds that common ground between all of us here on the floor who believe we ought to uphold our immigration law, but also think that families need to stay together. We need to have a compassionate approach to this. There is a consensus now on not separating families. That's good. But there's also a consensus we need an immigration system that works. So let's come together in both chambers. Let's do the hard work. Let's get this done. Of course, we need to do broader immigration reform as well. But this issue is staring us in the face. Let's keep families together. Let's provide for an immigration system that works over the long term, that provides compassionate care for those kids, that's in line with our country's values and enforces the laws of our country. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back my time.